if you meant in your last letter that we can scrap the whole idea of petitionary prayer, prayer which, as you put it, calls upon God to engineer particular events in the objective world and confine ourselves to acts of penitence and adoration, I disagree with you. It may be true that Christianity would be, intellectually, a far easier religion if it told us to do this. And I can understand the people who think it would also be a more high-minded religion. But remember the psalm, Lord, I am not high-minded. Or better still, remember the New Testament. The most unblushingly petitionary prayers are there recommended to us both by precept and example. Our Lord in Gethsemane made a petitionary prayer and did not get what he asked for. You'll remind me that he asked with a reservation, nevertheless, not my will, but thine. This makes an enormous difference, but the difference which it precisely does not make is that of removing the prayer's petitionary character. When poor Bill, on a famous occasion, asked us to advance him $100, he said, if you are sure you can spare it, and I shall quite understand if you'd rather not. This made his request very different from the nagging or even threatening request which a different sort of man might have made. But it was still a request. The servant is not greater and must not be more high-minded than the master. Whatever the theoretical difficulties are, we must continue to make request of God. And on this point, we can get no help from those who keep on reminding us that this is the lowest and least essential kind of prayer. They may be right, but so what? Diamonds are more precious than cairngorms, but the cairngorms still exist and must be taken into account like anything else. But don't let us be too easily browbeaten. Some of the popular objections to petitionary prayer, if they are valid against it, are equally valid against other things, which we all do, whether we are Christians or not, and have done ever since the world began, and shall certainly continue to do. I don't think the burden of answering these rests especially on us. There is, for example, the determinism, which, whether under that name or another, seems to be implicit in a scientific view of the world. Determinism does not deny the existence of human behavior. It rejects as an illusion our spontaneous conviction that our behavior has its ultimate origin in ourselves. What I call my act is the conduit pipe through which the torrent of the universal process passes and was bound to pass at a particular time and place. The distinction between what we call the voluntary and the involuntary movements of our own bodies is not obliterated, but turns out, on this view, to be not exactly the sort of difference we supposed. What I call the involuntary movements necessarily, and if we know enough predictably, result from mechanical causes outside my body or from pathological or organic processes within it. The voluntary ones result from conscious psychological factors, which themselves result from unconscious psychological factors dependent on my economic situation, my infantile and prenatal experience, my heredity, and so on back to the beginnings of organic life and beyond. I am a conductor, not a source. I never make an original contribution to the world process. I move with that process, not even as a floating log moves with the river, but as a particular pint of the water itself moves. But even those who believe this will, like anyone else, ask you to hand them the salt. Every form of behavior, including speech, can go on just the same and will. If a strict determinist believed in God, and I think he might, petitionary prayer would be no more irrational in him than in anyone else. Another argument put up but not accepted by Burnaby in Soundings is this. If man's freedom is to be of any value, if he is to have any power of planning and of adapting means to ends, he must live in a predictable world. But if God alters the course of events in answer to prayer, then the world will be unpredictable. Therefore, if man is to be effectively free, God must be in this respect unfree. But is it not plain that this predictable world, whether it is necessary to our freedom or no, is not the world we live in? This is a world of bets and insurance policies, of hopes and anxieties, where nothing is certain but the unexpected, and prudence lies in the masterly administration of the unforeseen. Nearly all the things people pray about are unpredictable. The result of a battle or an operation, the losing or getting of a job, the reciprocation of a love. We don't pray about eclipses, but, you will reply, we once did. Every advance of science makes predictable something that was formerly unpredictable. It is only our ignorance that makes petitionary prayer possible. Would it not be rational to assume that all those events we now pray about are in principle just as predictable, though we don't yet know enough to predict them, as things like eclipses? But that is no answer to the point I'm making. I am not now trying to refute determinism. I am only arguing that a world where the future is unknown cannot be inconsistent with planned and purposive action, since we are actually planning and purposing in such a world now, and have been doing so for thousands of years. Also, between ourselves, I think this objection involves a false idea of what the sciences do. You are here a better judge than I, but I give it for what it may be worth. It is true in one sense that the mark of a genuine science is its power to predict. But does this mean that a perfected science or a perfected synthesis of all the sciences would be able to write reliable histories of the future? And would the scientists even want to do so? Doesn't science predict a future event only insofar as, and only because, that event is the instance of some universal law? Everything that makes the event unique, in other words, everything that makes it a concrete historical event, is deliberately ruled out, not only as something which science can't or can't yet include, but also as something in which science as such has no interest. No one sunrise has ever been exactly like another. Take away from the sunrises that in which they differ, and what is left will be identical. Such abstracted identicals are what science predicts. But life as we live, it is not reducible to such identities. Every real physical event, much more every human experience, has behind it, in the long run, the whole previous history of the real universe, which is not itself an instance of anything, and is therefore always festooned with those particularities which science, for her own purposes, quite rightly discounts. Doesn't the whole art of contriving a good experiment consist in devising means whereby the irrelevancies, that is, the historical particularities, can be reduced to the minimum? Later in his essay, Burnaby seems to suggest that human wills are the only radically unpredictable factor in history. I'm not happy about this, partly because I don't see how the gigantic negative which it involves could be proved, partly because I agree with Bradley that unpredictability is not the essence, nor even a symptom, of freedom. Did you see they've reprinted ethical studies? The baiting of Arnold, wholly just, and in Arnold's own manner, is exquisite. But suppose it were true, even then it would make such a huge rent in the predictability of events that the whole idea of predictability as somehow necessary to human life would be in ruins. Think of the countless human acts of copulation spread over millennia that led to the birth of Plato, Attila, or Napoleon. Yet it is on these unpredictables that human history largely depends. 25 years ago, you asked Betty to marry you, and now, as a result, we have young George. I hope he's got over his gastric flu. 1,000 years hence, he might have a good many descendants, and only modesty could conceal from you the possibility that one of these might have as huge a historical effect as Aristotle or Hitler. What froth and bubble my last letter must have seemed to you. I had hardly posted it when I got Betty's card with the disquieting news about George, turning my jocular reference to his descendants into a stab, at least I suppose it did, and making our whole discussion on prayer seem to you, as it now does to me, utterly unreal. The distance between the abstract, does God hear petitionary prayers, and the concrete, will he, can he grant our prayers for George, is apparently infinite. Not, of course, that I can pretend for a moment to be able to feel it as you do. If I did, you would say to yourself, like the man in Macbeth, he has no children. A few years ago, when I was in my own trouble, you said as much to me. You wrote, I know I'm outside. My voice can hardly reach you. And that was one reason why your letter was more like the real grasp of a real hand than any other I got. The temptation is to attempt reassurances, to remind you how often a GP's preliminary diagnosis is wrong, that the symptoms are admittedly ambiguous, that threatened men sometimes live to a ripe old age. And it would all in fact be true. But what in that way could I say which you are not saying to yourself every hour? And you would know my motive. You'd know how little real scientific candor or knowledge lay behind my words. And if, which God forbid, your suspense ended as terribly as mine did, these reassurances would sound like mockeries. So at least I found. The memory of the false hopes was an additional torment. Even now, certain remembered moments of fallacious comfort twist my heart more than the remembered moment of despair. All may yet be well. This is true. Meanwhile, you have the waiting. Waiting till the X-rays are developed, until the specialist has completed his observations. And while you wait, you still have to go on living. If only one could go underground, hibernate, sleep it out. And then, for me, I believe you are stronger, the horrible byproducts of anxiety, the incessant circular movement of the thoughts, even the pagan temptation to keep watch for irrational omens. And one prays, but mainly such prayers as are themselves a form of anguish. Some people feel guilty about their anxieties and regard them as a defect of faith. I don't agree at all. They are afflictions, not sins. Like all afflictions, they are, if we can so take them, our share in the passion of Christ. For the beginning of the passion, the first move, so to speak, is in Gethsemane. In Gethsemane, a very strange and significant thing seems to have happened. It is clear from many of his sayings that our Lord had long foreseen his death. He knew what conduct, such as his, in a world such as we have made of this, must inevitably lead to. But it is clear that this knowledge must somehow have been withdrawn from him before he prayed in Gethsemane. He could not, with whatever reservation about the Father's will, have prayed that the cup might pass and simultaneously known that it would not. That's both a logical and a psychological impossibility. You see what this involves? Lest any trial incident to humanity should be lacking, the torments of hope, of suspense, anxiety, were at the last moment loosed upon him. The supposed possibility that after all he just conceivably might, be spared the supreme horror. There was precedent. Isaac had been spared. He too at the last moment. He also against all apparent probability. It was not quite impossible. And doubtless he had seen other men crucified, a sight very unlike most of our religious pictures and images. But for this last and erroneous hope against hope, and the consequent tumult of the soul, the sweat of blood, perhaps he would not have been very man. To live in a fully predictable world is not to be a man. At the end, I know, we are told that an angel appeared comforting him, but neither comforting in 16th century English nor in Greek means consoling. Strengthening is more the word. May not the strengthening have consisted in the renewed certainty, cold comfort this, that the thing must be endured and therefore could be? We all try to accept with some sort of submission our afflictions when they actually arrive, but the prayer in Gethsemane shows that the preceding anxiety is equally God's will and equally part of our human destiny. The perfect man experienced it, and the servant is not greater than the master. We are Christians, not Stoics. Does not every movement in the Passion write large some common element in the sufferings of our race? First the prayer of anguish, not granted. Then he turns to his friends. They are asleep as ours, or we, are so often, or busy, or away, or preoccupied. Then he faces the church, the very church that he brought into existence. It condemns him. This is also characteristic. In every church, in every institution, there is something which sooner or later works against the very purpose for which it came into existence. But there seems to be another chance. There is the state, in this case, the Roman state. Its pretensions are far lower than those of the Jewish church, but for that very reason, it may be free from local fanaticisms. It claims to be just on a rough worldly level. Yes, but only so far as is consistent with political expediency and raison d'etat. One becomes a counter in a complicated game. But even now, all is not lost. There is still an appeal to the people, the poor and simple, whom he had blessed, whom he had healed and fed and taught, to whom he himself belongs. But they have become overnight, it is nothing unusual, a murderous rabble shouting for his blood. There is then nothing left but God. And to God, God's last words are, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" You see how characteristic, how representative it all is. The human situation writ large. These are among the things it means to be a man. Every rope breaks when you seize it. Every door is slammed shut as you reach it. To be like the fox at the end of the run, the earth's all staked. As for the last dereliction of all, how can we either understand or endure it? Is it that God himself cannot be man, unless God seems to vanish at his greatest need? And if so, why? I sometimes wonder if we have even begun to understand what is involved in the very concept of creation. If God will create, he will make something to be, and yet to be not himself. To be created is, in some sense, to be ejected or separated? Can it be that the more perfect the creature is, the further this separation must at some point be pushed? It is saints, not common people, who experience the dark night. It is men and angels, not beasts, who rebel. Inanimate matter sleeps in the bosom of the Father. The hiddenness of God perhaps presses most painfully on those who are in another way nearest to him, and therefore God himself made man, will of all men be by God most forsaken. One of the 17th century divines says, by pretending to be visible, God could only deceive the world. Perhaps he does pretend just a little to simple souls who need a full measure of sensible consolation, not deceiving them, but tempering the wind to the shorn lamb. Of course, I'm not saying like Niebuhr that evil is inherent in finitude. That would identify the creation with the fall and make God the author of evil. But perhaps there is an anguish, an alienation, a crucifixion involved in the creative act. Yet he who alone can judge judges the far-off consummation to be worth it. I am, you see, a Job's comforter. Far from lightening the dark valley where you now find yourself, I blacken it. And you know why. Your darkness has brought back my own. But on second thoughts, I don't regret what I have written. I think it is only in a shared darkness that you and I can really meet at present, shared with one another, and, what matters most, with our Master. We are not on an untrodden path, rather on the main road. Certainly we were talking too lightly and easily about these things a fortnight ago. We were playing with counters, one used to be told as a child. Think what you're saying. Apparently, we need also to be told. Think what you're thinking. The stakes have to be raised before we take the game quite seriously. I know this is the opposite of what is often said about the necessity of keeping all emotion out of our intellectual process. You can't think straight unless you are cool. But then neither can you think deep if you are. I suppose one must try every problem in both states. You remember that the ancient Persians debated everything twice. Once when they were drunk, and once when they were sober. I know one of you will let me have news as soon as there is any.